This is the Butler Confessed, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I am Arthur Hastings, your faithful companion on yet another expedition into the shadowed corners of human nature. Allow me to express our deepest gratitude to our devoted listeners across the globe. If this is your maiden voyage with us, do consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling us from which corner of the world you listen. Lower your lights. You pour yourself a calming tisane in the manner of Poirot himself, and ready those little grey cells of yours. Chapter 1. An invitation not easily refused. I find myself, Lady Margaret Ravenscroft had written, in a hand that was still elegant but carried, Poirot thought, a faint tremor it had not possessed some years before, in need of a mind that values truth above comfort. Hercule Poirot had read the letter twice, and then set it upon his mantelpiece between a small bronze figurine and a perfectly symmetrical arrangement of correspondence. He had studied it for some moments with his head tilted very slightly to the left. Then he had sat down, pressed his fingertips together, and applied his little grey cells to the question of whether he wished to go to Hampshire at all. He did not, particularly. It was late autumn, and the countryside in late autumn was precisely the sort of environment Poirot found least congenial. Mud, damp, leaves in a state of advanced dissolution. The English, he reflected, possessed an inexplicable affection for all of this. They called it bracing. Poirot called it disagreeable. And yet he had gone. Lady Margaret was not a woman one refused lightly. She was, moreover, a woman to whom Poirot owed a small but specific debt of gratitude from a matter during the war. A matter that had required discretion, intelligence, and a certain willingness to look the other way at precisely the right moment. He had not forgotten it. Poirot forgot very little. The motor-car arrived at Ravenscroft Hall as the last pale light was draining from the sky, leaving behind it a darkness that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than fall from above. And the drive wound through yew hedges of extraordinary height and age, their clipped walls so precise they might have been cut from green stone. Through the smeared glass of the motor-car window, Poirot observed them with qualified approval. Whoever had shaped those hedges had understood the virtue of symmetry. He awarded the unknown gardener a small measure of respect. The house itself presented a less harmonious prospect. It was Victorian Gothic, which was to say that it was the architectural equivalent of a man who dresses with great seriousness for the wrong occasion entirely. High gables cut their angles against the pewter sky. Tall, mullioned windows gazed outward like half-closed eyes. A long stone terrace ran the length of the garden front, overlooking a formal parterre that had been arranged with the rigid geometry of a military parade ground. All of it was impressive. None of it was, to Poirot's continental sensibility, precisely comfortable. He descended from the motor-car into air that smelled of leaf mould and cold stone, and felt at once the particular quality of stillness that belongs to large houses in the final weeks of autumn. A stillness that is not peaceful, but watchful, as though the house is paying close attention. Briggs admitted him. The butler was a tall man of perhaps 60, with a face that conveyed absolutely nothing except the considered intention to convey nothing. His dark coat was impeccable. His movements had the fluid, unhurried precision of a man who had performed the same rituals for 30 years and would perform them for 30 more without the alteration of a single gesture. He took Poirot's coat. He expressed in precisely measured syllables that Lady Margaret would receive Monsieur Poirot in the drawing-room. He withdrew. Poirot stood for a moment in the entrance hall and looked about him. The portraits of dead Ravenscrofts lined the walls above the staircase. A procession of pale, composed faces arranged in chronological order, growing, Poirot noted with amusement, incrementally less interesting as one approached the present day. The hall smelled of beeswax, old wood, and something else, something fainter and less agreeable. Anxiety, Poirot sometimes thought, had a smell. It was not unlike stale flowers. The drawing-room was warm at least, and firelit. One tea had been set with admirable precision on a low table before the hearth, or very nearly admirable precision. Poirot's eye found the fault within 3 seconds of entering the room. The 2 armchairs that flanked the table had been positioned at slightly different angles to the fire, creating an asymmetry so minor that 999 persons out of 1,000 would not have noticed it at all. Poirot was, in this as in most matters, the 1,000th person. He adjusted both chairs. The correction required only a moment. He then straightened his tie, smoothed his moustache, which was, as always, in no need of smoothing, and turned to face the room. "The English," he murmured to no one, "they possess magnificent houses, but they do not respect symmetry." The other occupants of the room had watched this small performance with varying degrees of reaction. Lady Margaret Ravenscroft rose from the 3rd chair, which she had not moved, and which, Poirot noted with approval, she had been positioned correctly all along. She was a woman somewhere in her late 60s, elegant in the way that certain aristocratic English women remain elegant regardless of circumstance. Not through vanity, but through habit so deeply ingrained it had become indistinguishable from nature. Her hair was white and beautifully dressed. Her eyes were grey and very clear. Her handshake was firm. She was, Poirot thought, precisely the same woman she had been during the war, except that she was no longer quite so entirely in control of everything. The difference was very small, but Poirot noticed small differences. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "I am most grateful you have come. I hope the journey was not too disagreeable." "The journey," Poirot said with the diplomatic truthfulness he reserved for people he respected, "was instructive." She almost smiled. The others introduced themselves with a particular variety of English casualness that Poirot had learned, and over many years, to distrust. Casualness, in his experience, was frequently effortful. Adrian Ravenscroft was Lady Margaret's nephew, the heir, presumably, though he wore that fact lightly, as he appeared to wear most things. He was perhaps 32, with the easy manner and slightly restless quality of a man accustomed to charm his way past difficulties rather than address them directly. He shook Poirot's hand with great warmth and remarked that he'd heard a tremendous amount about him, which Poirot acknowledged with polite scepticism. Beside Adrian stood his sister Clara, younger by perhaps 5 or 6 years, with a gentle, open face and the particular expression of someone who listens more carefully than they speak. She was painting something, or had been. There were faint traces of cadmium yellow on her left wrist. She smiled at Poirot with what appeared to be entirely unaffected warmth. He reserved judgment. In his experience, a warmth that appeared entirely unaffected was sometimes the most carefully arranged kind. Dr. Simon Calder was a man of about 50, with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent more time outdoors than most physicians find strictly necessary. and the jovial authority of a family doctor who has known his patients long enough to have ceased finding their complaints surprising. He greeted Poirot with energetic cordiality. He was, Poirot noted, standing just slightly further from Lady Margaret than social convention required. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing Poirot committed, as a matter of course, to the filing system of his memory. Evelyn Harper occupied the far end of the room with the practiced unobtrusiveness of a woman who has spent years learning to be overlooked. She was Lady Margaret's secretary and companion, a woman of perhaps 40, neither plain nor striking, with quiet, watchful eyes behind round spectacles and hands that were still and perfectly composed in her lap. She acknowledged Poirot's arrival with a brief, contained nod. She said nothing. Poirot found her immediately interesting. Tea proceeded. The conversation was what it was supposed to be, general, pleasant, and entirely uninformative. The weather, the drive from London, the age of the house, its history, the restoration work Lady Margaret had undertaken on the East Wing. Adrian was amusing about it. Clara was enthusiastic. Dr. Calder had several opinions. Evelyn Harper said very little and watched a great deal. Poirot sipped his tisane. He had brought his own, correctly anticipating that the household would provide nothing of the sort. And listened and observed and felt something beneath the agreeable surface of the occasion that he could not yet name. Strained politeness, he decided. That was the quality of the air in this room. Every person present was being, at considerable effort, perfectly pleasant. Which meant, in Poirot's experience, that something had recently made pleasantness require effort. The letter arrived at 5:15. Briggs entered with the unhurried gravity that appeared to be his only available mode of movement, and presented a silver tray to Lady Margaret. Upon it lay a single envelope. She took it with a murmured word of thanks. The room continued its conversation. Adrian said something amusing. Clara laughed. Poirot watched Lady Margaret open the envelope. He saw, because he was watching, and because he watched everything, the precise moment when her composure broke. It lasted no longer than 2 seconds. A contraction of the fingers around the paper, a very slight, very rapid alteration in her breathing, the colour leaving her face not dramatically, but in the manner of a light being slowly turned down. Then control reasserted itself, seamlessly, much like water closing over a stone. "You must excuse me for a moment," she said with magnificent steadiness. "A small household matter." She left the room. Poirot set down his cup very carefully and looked at the fire. The conversation resumed around him. Dr. Calder was now explaining something about a patient, a fishing story, essentially, with a medical certificate in place of a rod. Adrian laughed in the right places. Clara looked at her tea. Evelyn Harper's eyes moved briefly to the door through which Lady Margaret had gone, and then returned steadily to her own hands. It was, Poirot thought, a very revealing 30 seconds, if one knew how to read it. He was not, perhaps, entirely sorry he had come to Hampshire after all. Later, after dinner, after the household had performed its evening rituals with the appearance of complete normality, and after the good nights had been exchanged and the various doors along the corridor had clicked shut one by one, Poirot stood at his bedroom window and looked out at the dark shapes of the yew hedges below. From somewhere in the depths of the house, he could hear voices. He was not a man who eavesdropped as a matter of course. He was, however, a man who recognized that certain coincidences are not coincidences at all, but rather information presenting itself in the only form currently available. Then when he opened his bedroom door to investigate an entirely legitimate matter concerning the location of the bathroom, and when the corridor happened to pass within earshot of the study, and when two voices, Lady Margaret's and Adrian's, happened to be clearly audible through the study door, which was standing a few inches ajar, Poirot considered this a sequence of events for which he bore no particular responsibility. He heard Adrian say, one with a quiet fierceness that carried through the stillness very clearly, "Then you should have told the truth years ago." Then silence. Poirot stood very still, and then, at the far end of the corridor, he became aware of another figure. Thomas Briggs stood beside the service door, his dark form almost invisible in the shadow. He was not moving. He was quite simply there, in the manner of a man who has been there for some time, listening to the same exchange with the same close attention. As Poirot watched, Briggs became aware that he was observed. He made no start, no gesture of surprise. He simply turned his head, met Poirot's gaze across the length of the corridor with an expression that revealed precisely nothing, inclined his head with the gravity of a bishop acknowledging a colleague, and walked without haste away through the service door. The door closed behind him without a sound. Poirot stood in the dark corridor and listened to the house settle around him, and felt the unease he had been unable to name since his arrival take on, at last, a slightly more definite shape. Something in this house was waiting. He was not yet certain what it was waiting for, but he was increasingly certain that it would not wait very much longer. Chapter 2. The Weight of the House. Poirot slept badly, which was unusual. He was, as a rule, a man of orderly habits that extended even to his unconscious hours. He retired at a reasonable time, or he arranged himself with precision, and he woke refreshed. Ravenscroft Hall, however, declined to cooperate with this arrangement. The house made noises, not the dramatic, purposeful noises of sensation fiction, but the quiet, persistent sounds of a very old building conducting its private business. A distant creak, the sigh of a pipe, the barely audible scrape of something against glass that was probably a branch and was not, in any rational assessment, worth attention, or it was the branch that kept him awake. Not from fear, from the nagging suspicion that it was not a branch at all, and that his insistence on the rational explanation was itself a kind of intellectual cowardice. He rose at 6:30, dressed with his customary care, and descended to find the house still wearing its nighttime quiet. The long corridor smelled of cold stone and yesterday's wood smoke. The portraits watched him pass with their customary aristocratic indifference. He paused before one, a woman of perhaps 40, painted in the style of the previous century, with a direct gaze and a set to her mouth that suggested she had opinions and was disinclined to keep them to herself. He read the small brass plate below. Eleanor Ravenscroft, 1841. He moved on. The morning room was empty except for Evelyn Harper, who sat at the writing table near the window with a cup of tea at her elbow and a letter open before her. She looked up when Poirot entered, then something in her expression shifted. Not alarm precisely, but the particular recalibration of a person who has been private and finds themselves no longer so. Monsieur Poirot. Her voice was pleasant, measured, giving nothing away. You are an early riser. Habit, mademoiselle. And you? Necessity. She folded the letter, unhurriedly, naturally, which was in itself, Poirot noted, a kind of skill, and set it beneath her correspondence case. Lady Margaret depends upon a great deal of correspondence being managed before the household properly begins. Poirot poured himself coffee. There was no tisane. He had expected as much. And sat in the chair nearest the window, which afforded him a view of both the garden and, at an angle, of Miss Harper herself. The morning was grey and still. On the terrace below, a blackbird was attending to something in the gravel with systematic intensity. You have been with Lady Margaret long?" Poirot asked, in the tone of a man making agreeable conversation on a dull morning. 7 years. Then you know the household well. One does, after 7 years. And the family, Mr. Ravenscroft, Miss Clara. A pause, brief, calibrated. Sufficiently well. Poirot smiled at the garden. The blackbird had found whatever it was looking for and departed. "You are," he observed pleasantly, "a woman of great economy, Miss Harper. Every word precisely sufficient, and not one beyond." She looked at him then with something that was not quite amusement and not quite caution, but occupied the interesting territory between the two. "I have found," she said, "that it is generally the wisest approach. In this household specifically, or as a general philosophical position. The not quite amusement increased, fractionally. Both, I think." He did not press further. He had learned what he wished to learn, not from her answers, which told him little, but from the quality of her restraint, which told him considerably more. Evelyn Harper was a woman who chose her words with the deliberate care of someone for whom careless speech had once had consequences. He filed the observation neatly and turned his attention to the garden. Breakfast was served at 8:30 in the dining-room, with the full ceremonial gravity that Briggs appeared to bring to every domestic occasion, regardless of scale. There were kidneys. There was toast in a rack that Poirot regarded with the mild sorrow he always felt in the presence of toast racks, whose entire purpose seemed to be the efficient cooling of bread. There was at least excellent coffee. Lady Margaret appeared last, at 20 minutes to 9. She was immaculately dressed and entirely composed, and had she not been standing slightly too correctly, the composure of effort rather than ease. Poirot would perhaps not have noticed anything amiss at all. She took her seat. She directed a remark to Dr. Calder about the weather. She accepted coffee from Briggs with a murmured word of thanks. Briggs poured it with the same fluid, practised gravity with which he did everything. His face, serving, was the face of a man who has ceased to be quite present, professionally absent in the way of long-experienced servants, inhabiting the room without occupying it. He moved to refill Adrian's cup. He withdrew to the sideboard, and nothing in his bearing suggested anything other than 30 years of impeccable service. And yet, Poirot watched him throughout the meal with the patience of a man who is in no hurry and has nowhere else to be. He watched the angle of Briggs' attention, ostensibly directed at the sideboard, the coffee pot, the imperceptible requirement for more toast, and noted how it arranged itself with the finest adjustment toward Lady Margaret. Not the attentiveness of service, something older than that, and more complex. Adrian was talking about the East Wing restoration. There were opinions about the contractor, apparently, and Dr. Calder was contributing observations from his own experience with a property in Wiltshire. And Clara was listening to both, with the expression of someone who has heard the East Wing controversy several times previously, and has arrived at a settled position of fond tolerance. The table was, on its surface, entirely ordinary. Poirot, beneath the surface, here was very busy. After breakfast, he contrived to encounter Dr. Calder in the library, where the doctor had retired with the newspaper and the expression of a man who considers the morning's social obligations satisfactorily discharged. The library was a handsome room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather chairs of genuine age and comfort, a long window seat overlooking the kitchen garden. On the mantelpiece a clock ticked with the unhurried authority of English domestic time. "A fine collection," Poirot remarked, surveying the shelves. Calder lowered his newspaper 2 inches. "Mostly Alistair's, the late Sir Alistair. Lady Margaret reads, but she's not a collector. Adrian certainly isn't." He said this last with an affectionate bluntness that told Poirot he was a man comfortable with frank assessments of people he liked. "Clara has added a good many of the modern ones, there at the end." "You have known the family a long time, I think?" 20 years, give or take. I came as physician when old Forsyth retired, stayed as something between doctor and friend. That happens in these households. You become part of the furniture." He paused. "I mean that kindly." "I understood it so." Poirot settled himself in the chair opposite. "And in 20 years one sees a great deal." Calder's eyes above the newspaper were shrewd. He was, Poirot revised his earlier assessment, rather less straightforwardly jovial than he appeared. "One sees what one sees," he said. "A diplomatic answer." "I'm a doctor. Discretion is professional duty." "Naturellement," Poirot inclined his head. "And yet you are here this weekend, which suggests Lady Margaret wished for your particular presence. A doctor, a trusted friend, at a time when—" He allowed a small pause. "A letter has unsettled her considerably." The newspaper descended fully. Calder regarded him with an expression that had moved some distance from jovial. "She told you about the letter?" "She told me nothing," and I observed. "It is not quite the same thing." Poirot smiled pleasantly. "You knew of it already, I think?" A silence. Outside, the kitchen garden sat in its grey autumn stillness, the stripped rose canes tied to their frames like small surrenders. Then Calder said, carefully, "She has been worried for some weeks. About what precisely she did not confide in me. I came because she asked me to come." He folded the newspaper with the controlled decision of a man reaching a conclusion. "That is the truth, Poirot. Whether it is all of the truth is a question I am not yet able to answer." It was, Poirot reflected, the most honestly incomplete answer he had received from anyone in the house thus far, and it raised his opinion of Calder considerably. He spent the remainder of the morning in an apparently aimless progress through the ground floor of the house, pausing here to examine a portrait, there to admire the arrangement of a room, elsewhere to engage Clara in a conversation about watercolour technique that was entirely genuine on his part, and seemed to ease something in her that had been held carefully all morning. She had her mother's eyes, he thought, then corrected himself. Lady Margaret was her aunt. He noted the correction. It was Clara, in the comfortable candour of artistic conversation, who said the thing that settled in Poirot's mind, like a stone dropped into still water. "She's been frightened," Clara said, quietly, looking at the painting before her rather than at Poirot. "Not anxious. Aunt Margaret is never merely anxious. Frightened, for weeks now. Since sometime in September, I think, though I couldn't say exactly when it began." She paused, dipping a brush. There are things about this family's past that were never spoken of. I always understood that as a kind of gentleman's agreement. Lately, I have begun to wonder whether it was rather more like a locked door. Poirot said nothing, and sometimes silence was the most productive response. "And locked doors," Clara added, almost to herself, "do not stay locked forever." It was at that moment that Poirot heard, from the direction of the study at the far end of the corridor, a sound he could not immediately identify. Not a voice, not quite a footstep. A sharp, brief, percussive sound, as though something small and hard had struck the floor. He excused himself. He walked quickly, but without the appearance of hurry, to the study door, which stood 3/4 closed. He pushed it open. The room was empty. The fire burned low. At the desk, a cup of coffee stood beside an open ledger, steam still rising from it in a thin, curling thread. And on the floor, just before the desk, lay a small silver pocket watch, its face down on the turkey carpet. Poirot stood very still. He looked at the watch. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at the watch again. Then he crossed to the desk, crouched with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not trust Turkish carpets to be entirely level, and examined the watch without touching it. It had stopped. The hands read 12 minutes past 8. Breakfast, as everyone in the house could attest, had been served at 8:30. Poirot straightened. He was very still for a moment in the way that those who knew him would have recognized. The stillness of a man in whom something has just begun to move. He took a clean handkerchief from his breast pocket, picked up the watch with great care and slipped it into his coat. Then he turned and found Thomas Briggs standing in the doorway. The butler's face was, as always, perfectly composed. He looked at Poirot. He looked at the desk. Whatever calculation he performed behind those still eyes, it was completed in the space of 2 seconds and left no trace upon his expression. "Will there be anything, monsieur?" he asked. "Non," said Poirot pleasantly. "I thank you, Briggs. There is nothing, at present." He held the butler's gaze for a moment longer than the exchange required. Briggs withdrew. His footsteps along the corridor were measured, unhurried and entirely silent. Poirot stood alone in the study and turned the stopped watch, very gently in his handkerchief. 12 minutes past 8, before breakfast, before the coffee had been brought. He looked at the cup, still faintly steaming, still untouched, and felt the shape of something that was not yet a thought, but was, he suspected, about to become one. Somewhere in the house a door closed, and then another sound, a woman's voice, and then silence. And Poirot realized with sudden, absolute certainty that what he had heard was not a sound of anything ordinary at all. Chapter 3. The Confession of Thomas Briggs. The sound Poirot had heard was a scream, though not the theatrical kind. It was short, involuntary, and then quickly suppressed. The sound a person makes when the body reacts before the mind has had opportunity to counsel restraint. It came from the direction of the study, which was to say, it came from the room he had left not 40 seconds before. He moved back along the corridor with speed that would have surprised those acquainted only with the more deliberate rhythms of his usual progress. Clara was already there, her hand pressed flat against the study door, as though she had arrived at a run and stopped herself by force of will. Behind her, Evelyn Harper stood with a stillness that was different in quality from her customary composure. Rigid rather than settled, the stillness of shock. Poirot pushed open the door. Lady Margaret Ravenscroft sat upright at her desk. That was the first thing. The terrible ordinariness of the posture, the suggestion that she was simply engaged in some correspondence and had not yet looked up. The coffee cup stood at her right hand exactly as Poirot had left it. The ledger lay open. Everything was precisely as it had been, with the single difference that Lady Margaret was dead. He knew it at once. There is a quality to the stillness of the dead that is unlike any other stillness, and Poirot had encountered it often enough that he no longer needed to search for signs. He crossed to her quickly. I confirmed what he already knew and turned. "Miss Ravenscroft." His voice was quiet and very steady. "Go and fetch Dr. Calder, if you please. Directly." He met Clara's eyes. They were wide and dark, with something that was not yet grief. Grief would come, but this was its anteroom, the moment of pure, unprocessed fact. "Go now, quickly." She went. He turned to Evelyn Harper, who had not moved from the doorway. "Mademoiselle." She looked at him. Whatever was happening behind those round spectacles was contained, managed, folded inward. "Yes," she said, as though answering a question he had not asked. "You will please stay here with me until the doctor comes." She came into the room and stood beside the window, her hands clasped before her, looking not at Lady Margaret, but at the garden. Her breathing was even. Poirot, who was watching her with the full concentration he generally took care to disguise, found her response neither suspicious nor reassuring. It was simply opaque. She was a woman who had, at some cost, made herself opaque, and she was not going to become transparent merely because the situation required it. Dr. Calder arrived within 3 minutes, Clara a step behind him. He went to Lady Margaret with the brisk authority of a man translating distress into procedure, and confirmed Poirot's assessment with the grim economy of professional habit. "Dead. An hour at least. I should think, possibly more. I'll need to examine her properly." He straightened and something crossed his face. Not surprise, Poirot noted, but the expression of a man whose fears have been confirmed rather than created. "I'll telephone for the police." Adrian arrived last, drawn by Clara's voice in the corridor. He stopped in the doorway and looked at his aunt and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then, "Good God." The words were flat, stripped of affect by shock. He put his hand on the doorframe. He did not enter the room. It was into this suspended tableau. Clara weeping quietly against the wall, Adrian still in the doorway, Evelyn at the window, Calder at the telephone. That Thomas Briggs appeared. He had come, apparently, to inquire whether Lady Margaret required anything further from the kitchen. He stood in the doorway beside Adrian, took in the scene before him with those still, assessing eyes, and was silent for precisely 4 seconds. Then he said, in a voice of absolute, terrible calm, "I killed her." The words fell into the room like stones into water, and the silence that followed them was complete. "I poisoned her coffee," he continued with the same dreadful steadiness, as though reciting a prepared text. "During the breakfast service this morning, I have served this family for 30 years. I have long believed, that my service was neither valued nor fairly compensated, and that Lady Margaret regarded me as furniture rather than as a man. I put the substance in her cup when I poured it. I am prepared to make a full statement to the police." He folded his hands before him. He looked at no one in particular. The first person to speak was Adrian, which surprised Poirot slightly. He had expected Calder. "Briggs." The name came out as something between an objection and a question. Mr. Adrian. The butler's voice was polite, immovable. I would prefer not to discuss the matter further until the police arrive. Clara had stopped weeping. She was staring at Briggs with an expression of naked distress, and Poirot observed that it was not the distress of someone confronted with unexpected guilt, but rather of someone confronted with something they cannot quite bring themselves to believe. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Poirot. He gave her nothing in return. Not yet. Inspector Webb of the Hampshire Constabulary arrived at 11 o'clock in a motor car that left a great deal of mud on the gravel drive, accompanied by a sergeant whose principal quality appeared to be a reliable capacity for writing things down. Webb was a solid, practical man of 50 with the look of someone who had seen enough of human misbehaviour to have developed a working philosophy about it. Now, which philosophy appeared to be that the shortest distance between a crime and its solution was the most direct available confession. Briggs's statement, therefore, delighted him in the way that things delight men who are very busy. He interviewed the household in the dining room, individually, with a thoroughness that was genuine, if not especially subtle. He spoke to Adrian, who confirmed the argument of the previous evening with a discomfort that was evidently real, and a version of its content that was, Poirot suspected, edited. He spoke to Calder, who gave him the medical facts with precision and the personal context with careful restraint. He spoke to Clara, who was by then composed enough to answer steadily, if not especially fully. He spoke to Evelyn Harper, who was precise, cooperative, and entirely uninformative. He spoke, finally, to Poirot, with a respect that was genuine and a barely perceptible undertone of the wish that Poirot were, perhaps, solving a crime somewhere else. Poirot understood the feeling. He did not take it personally. Straightforward enough, Webb said afterward, with the satisfaction of a man whose existing theory has survived interrogation. Motives there, 30 years of accumulated grievance, means he had access to every room, every cup in the house. Opportunity? He poured the coffee himself, in front of witnesses. In front of witnesses, Poirot repeated pleasantly. Yes, that is one way to consider it. Webb looked at him. You have a different way. I have at present only a question. Poirot produced the silver watch from his breast pocket, still wrapped in its handkerchief, and set it on the table between them with the delicacy of a man placing a particularly fragile argument. This was on the floor of the study when I entered it, some minutes before the body was discovered. Either hands read 8:12. Breakfast was served at 8:30. Webb examined it with a frown. Watch stopped. Happens all the time. It happens, Poirot agreed. One asks only why it happened at this moment, to this watch, in this room, at this time. He tilted his head. You are not curious, Inspector? Curious enough. Webb's tone was the tone of a man who is slightly curious and mostly satisfied. But a confession's a confession, Monsieur Poirot. Briggs was the one with access. Briggs made the statement. The evidence supports it. The evidence, Poirot said softly, does not contradict it. That is a somewhat different thing. Webb accepted this distinction with the polite skepticism of a man who considers it academic. He was preparing to charge Briggs. The household was confined to the estate pending further inquiry. The matter was, in his estimation, essentially resolved. Poirot watched Briggs led from the house with an expression that those who knew him would have found revealing. It was not satisfaction. It was not even pity, precisely. It was the expression of a man who has been told a story that is almost entirely plausible and has noticed the single word that rings, to the trained ear, just faintly false. He returned to the study. He stood before the desk, the empty chair, the cold coffee cup. The cup, he noted now, looking with fresh attention, Anna was positioned on Lady Margaret's right. Lady Margaret, he had observed at breakfast, received her coffee on her left. A small thing. The kind of small thing that a man of 30 years' impeccable service would not get wrong. And there was something else. He leaned close to the cup without touching it. He looked at the rim, the handle, the pale inner curve of the porcelain. No fingerprints, or rather, actually the particular absence of fingerprints. A smoothness on the handle where a hand must have gripped it. That means not that no one touched it, but that whoever touched it took some care about what they left behind. Briggs had poured the coffee in front of witnesses. He had touched the cup, necessarily, in front of witnesses, and yet the cup bore no trace of him. Poirot straightened. He pressed his fingertips together and stood very still, looking at nothing in particular and thinking about a great deal. "So," he said at last to the empty room, "our butler confesses to a crime he did not commit." The fire had gone out. The cold was settling into the study with the comfortable permanence of a thing that intends to stay. And somewhere in the house, he was not certain where, but he was certain enough. Someone was waiting to learn whether a very carefully arranged story had held. It had not held. But they did not know that yet, while Poirot found that, on balance, he preferred it that way. Chapter 4. Questions that are not questions. Lunch was not served. This was, in its small way, as informative as anything else that had occurred that morning. A household in which the routine has collapsed is a household in which people have stopped performing. The performances, Poirot had found, were frequently where the truth resided, in the gap between what a person chose to show and what briefly escaped them in unguarded moments. Without the scaffolding of ordinary domestic ritual, the gaps multiplied, and Poirot moved through the afternoon with the quiet attentiveness of a man who understands that grief and fear, mingled together, produce a particularly fertile ground for revelation. He began with Adrian. He found him in the billiard room, not playing, but standing at the long window with a glass of brandy that appeared to be his second, tilting it slightly so that the pale afternoon light moved through it. He turned when Poirot entered, and his expression arranged itself into something carefully neutral, which was itself a kind of answer to a question Poirot had not yet asked aloud. "I shan't pretend I'm devastated," Adrian said before Poirot had spoken. "That would be dishonest, and I expect you'd see through it immediately." He drank. "I was fond of her, in the way one is fond of something that has always been there. A piece of furniture, Calder would say." A short, humourless exhalation. But we were not easy with each other. We hadn't been for some time. "The argument," Poirot said, settling himself without ceremony into the nearest chair, "of the previous evening. You heard it, not a question. I heard a portion, sufficient to understand that the subject was not new and that it had a history." Adrian turned back to the window. The garden below was the colour of pewter, the formal beds stripped to their winter architecture of bare canes and dark earth. "Where she had money I needed," he said flatly. "That is the plain truth of it, and I imagine the police will have it shortly in any case. Gambling debts, not catastrophic, but pressing. I had asked her twice. She had refused twice. We argued. I said something I should not have. He paused. Several things. The phrase that was audible to me, Poirot said carefully, concerned truth and the advisability of having told it years ago. Something shifted in Adrian's face, a tightening, brief and controlled. That was not about the money. No, Poirot agreed. I did not suppose it was. The silence that followed was of the productive variety. Adrian finished his brandy with the decision of a man reaching a conclusion. There are things about this family that I have known in outline for some years and have never attempted to know in detail. My aunt preferred it that way. He stopped. I believed for most of my life, and that what I didn't press for, I couldn't be held responsible for. He set the glass on the billiard table with a small, definitive sound. I'm no longer entirely comfortable with that position. It was more candid than Poirot had expected and more self-aware. He revised Adrian upward, moderately. A reckless man, certainly, and an indebted one, but not, he thought, a dishonest one about the things that mattered. About money, perhaps. About himself, less so. He found Clara in the conservatory, just sitting among the overwintered plants with a sketchbook open on her knee, and a pencil making small, repetitive marks on the page that bore no relation to drawing. She had been crying again, or recently, and was not embarrassed about it, which Poirot respected. Some griefs require performance, others simply occupy the person they belong to, and Clara's was evidently of the latter kind. He did not sit. He stood among the dusty geraniums and the smell of damp compost, and spoke to her quietly, or without preamble. You said this morning that there are things about this family's past that were never spoken of. I should like to understand what you know of them. Clara looked at her sketchbook. The repetitive marks had resolved, he noticed, into the shape of a door. Small, repeated, scratched with increasing firmness. Not a great deal, actually. Only impressions over many years. She turned the pencil in her fingers. There was a woman my aunt employed, before I was old enough to remember. A servant of some kind in the household during my uncle's time. She was dismissed, I understand, or left under circumstances that were not discussed. There was a child involved, I think. Or that was the impression I received from things said and then immediately unsaid in the way adults have when they remember a child is present. You were told nothing directly. One never was in this family. The Ravenscrofts, she said, and with a sadness that was also a kind of wry affection. Consider silence a form of good manners. And recently, in the weeks before your aunt's, before this, Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wood pigeon attended to the bare branches of the copper beech with the single-minded purposefulness of a creature for whom the world's complexities have been satisfactorily reduced to the question of what to eat next. She destroyed something, Clara said at last. About 3 weeks ago, I came into the study without knocking. I had done so 100 times. And she was burning papers in the grate, not the ordinary sort of burning old letters and receipts. She was systematic about it. She had a pile, and she was putting them in one by one, and she was watching each one until it was entirely gone. She paused. She was frightened, Monsieur Poirot, not of fire, of what the papers contained. Poirot thanked her and went in search of Evelyn Harper. She was not in the morning room, nor the library, nor anywhere on the ground floor. He found her eventually in the room that adjoined Lady Margaret's study, a small, functional room with a desk, a typewriting machine, and the orderly filing systems of a woman who considered disorganization a minor moral failing. She was working, or had arranged herself to appear to be working, sorting correspondence into categories with the brisk efficiency of someone who has decided that continued occupation is the only viable response to the day. Poirot knocked on the open door. She looked up. "May I?" He indicated the chair on the near side of the desk. "Of course." Her voice was pleasant, composed, and gave him the feeling, familiar from their earlier conversation, of a door held courteously open onto a room from which everything of significance has been quietly removed. He sat. He looked, with apparent interest, at the typewriting machine, the correspondence trays, the orderly shelves of filed documents. 7 years, he said. "You managed all of this for 7 years." Lady Margaret was thorough in her record-keeping. It was not difficult work. Demanding, perhaps, in other ways. She met his eyes. Her own were steady, revealing nothing. "All positions have their demands." "Quite so." Poirot placed his fingertips together. "Mademoiselle, I will be direct, because I think you are a woman who prefers directness even when it is inconvenient. You came to this household 7 years ago. You have remained. In my experience, a secretary companion to an elderly woman of Lady Margaret's character either leaves within the first year, finding the work uncongenial, or remains indefinitely. Those who remain indefinitely generally have a reason beyond the professional." Something passed across her face. The faintest alteration, as though a light had changed behind a curtain. Lady Margaret was a conscientious employer. She was. "And before this household? Where were you before?" A pause, half a second too long. "Various positions. I can provide references if the police require them." "I do not doubt it." Poirot smiled pleasantly. "I ask not because I doubt your competence, mademoiselle, but because a woman of your evident intelligence does not spend 7 years in a Hampshire country house managing correspondence unless she finds something there that matters to her. Beyond the correspondence." Evelyn Harper looked at him for a long moment with those still, watchful eyes, and Poirot looked back with the serene patience of a man who has waited longer for considerably less. "Lady Margaret was a complicated woman," she said at last, "as most people are, who have lived long enough." "Complicated," Poirot agreed. "Yes, that is one word." He rose, thanked her, and left her to her filing. In the corridor, he stood for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze directed at the middle distance, which is to say, at nothing at all and everything simultaneously. 3 conversations, 3 degrees of concealment. Adrian's the most transparent, Clara's the most genuinely unknowing, Evelyn Harper's the most deliberately constructed. Of the 3, it was Harper's careful non-answers that occupied him most fully, because a woman who says almost nothing and means a great deal more is a woman who has something to protect. The question was whether she was protecting herself or protecting something else entirely. He walked to the far end of the corridor and stood before the study door, which was still closed. Through it, the room where Lady Margaret had died maintained its silence with the totality that only empty rooms achieve. He thought about the coffee cup. He thought about the watch. He thought about papers burning in a grate one by one, with the care of someone ensuring that nothing remained. Then he thought about something Clara had said without, he suspected, understanding that she had said anything at all. She was systematic about it. Lady Margaret, destroying evidence of the past had been systematic. It was, he reflected, entirely in keeping with the character he had observed, a woman of great control, great method, great care for the appearance of things. Even her fear was orderly. But there was something else in the word, something that pointed, not at Lady Margaret, but at the person Poirot had been thinking about most since that morning. Systematic, careful, invisible when she chose to be. He removed the pocket watch from his breast pocket and looked at it for a long moment. 12 minutes past 8. The hands had not moved, would not move again. Whatever had stopped them had done so with the decisive finality of a full stop at the end of a sentence. The sentence, Poirot was becoming increasingly convinced, had begun the previous night. Chapter 5. The method in the absurdity. The portraits of the dead Ravenscrofts had been regarding Poirot with cold, aristocratic patience for 2 days, and on the morning of the 3rd day he decided, quite suddenly, to regard them back. He stood in the entrance hall with his hands clasped behind him and his head tilted at the slight angle that indicated serious professional engagement, and he examined each face in turn with the same methodical attention he would have given to a room full of suspects, which, in a sense, is precisely what they were. The past, in Poirot's experience, was rarely as past as people wished it to be. It had a disagreeable tendency to remain present, wearing the face of the future. Clara found him there at 8:30, and stopped on the second stair with the look of someone uncertain whether to interrupt. "Tell me," Poirot said without turning, "the portraits, they are arranged chronologically?" "From the landing down, yes, the earliest at the top." She descended another step. "Is that relevant?" "Everything is potentially relevant, Miss Ravenscroft. That is the beginning of the method. The end of the method is determining which potentially relevant things are actually relevant and which are merely interesting. It requires," he added with a faint smile in her direction, "a certain tolerance for absurdity in the interim." She came down to stand beside him. They looked together at a woman painted circa 1880. Severe, handsome, with the expression of someone who has recently won an argument and expects to win the next one also. "That is Constance Ravenscroft," Clara said. "My great-great-aunt, I think. She was by all accounts formidable." "The Ravenscroft women," Poirot observed, "appear consistently formidable. It is perhaps a characteristic of the line." He paused. "Your great-aunt included." Clara was quiet for a moment. She was. She was also kind in her way. I want you to understand that. Whatever she did or failed to do, she was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who believed very completely in certain things. The family, the name, are to the continuation of what had been built. She stopped. I think she could convince herself that protecting those things was the same as doing right, and I think she was wrong about that. But I don't think she was wicked. It was the most considered judgment Poirot had heard offered in that house, and he received it with the gravity it deserved. "You are," he said quietly, "a fair-minded person, Miss Ravenscroft. It is rarer than it should be." He left her with the portraits and went in search of Dr. Calder, whom he found in the kitchen garden, inexplicably and with some vigour, turning compost. Calder straightened when he heard footsteps on the gravel, fork in hand, with the slightly self-conscious expression of a man caught in an activity he cannot readily explain. "Helps me think," he said before Poirot could speak. "Always has. Digging. Something about the physical engagement frees the mind." He considered the fork. Or possibly, I simply cannot sit still. I have my little grey cells, Poirot said. You have your compost. We each proceed as we must. He stopped at the low brick wall that bordered the bed and looked at the stripped vegetable rows with the expression of a man who finds the countryside somewhat more comprehensible in its cultivated form. I have a question, mon ami. That is not precisely a question. Calder planted the fork and leaned on it with the ease of a big man comfortable in his own body. Those are generally the most important kind. The dinner on the night before Lady Margaret died. You were present throughout? From soup to port, yes. The menu, if you recall it. Calder blinked. It was, evidently, not what he had expected. The menu, let me think. Soup, a clear consommé. Fish course, sole, I believe. The main was a roast, lamb. Then a pudding. Something with apples, and the cheese board. He paused. Why? And the wines. Hock with the fish, a claret with the lamb. A good one. Alistair's cellar was always reliable. Port afterward for those who wanted it. He was watching Poirot now with the sharpened attention of a man who has decided the questions are not as absurd as they appear. Poirot. Who poured the port? A pause. Briggs initially, and then Adrian helped himself and left the decanter on the table. And Lady Margaret, she took port? She did not. She took nothing after the claret. She seemed, Calder chose the word carefully, preoccupied. She excused herself before the port was finished. Said she had correspondence. At what time? 9:30, perhaps 9:45. And the others remained in the dining room? Adrian and I did for perhaps another 20 minutes. His Clara had already gone up. She retires early when she's painting. Miss Harper accompanied Lady Margaret from the room. He stopped. The fork shifted in the soil. Miss Harper accompanied her. Just so, Poirot said pleasantly, and moved on before Calder could pursue it further. He spent the remainder of the morning in the library, which had the virtue of being both warm and unoccupied, attending to what he privately described as the architecture of the thing. He did not pace. Pacing was for men who thought with their bodies, which was an inefficiency Poirot had never found necessary. He sat in the leather chair with his fingertips pressed together and his eyes half closed, and he built. What he was building was a sequence, not the sequence that had been presented to Inspector Webb. The tidy morning narrative of a poisoned coffee cup and a butler's 30-year resentment. But the sequence beneath it, which he was increasingly certain had begun in the study the previous evening, sometime between 9:30 and the small hours of the night. He had established that Lady Margaret left dinner early, troubled, accompanied by Evelyn Harper. That she had been burning papers for weeks, evidence of something she feared being found. That the letter of the previous afternoon had shaken her profoundly. That Adrian had argued with her in the study that evening, the content of the argument pointing to a family secret of some substance. And that Thomas Briggs had stood in the shadow of the service corridor and listened to that argument with the careful attention of a man to whom its subject was not unknown. He had also established, and this was the hinge, the point on which everything turned, that the coffee cup bore no fingerprints consistent with normal handling, and that Lady Margaret's silver pocket watch had stopped at 8:12, or before breakfast was served, apparently from contact with liquid. He turned his mind to the watch. He held the image of it precisely as he had found it, face down on the turkey carpet 2 feet from the desk. A watch does not fall from a person's pocket in the ordinary course of sitting at a desk. It falls during movement, or during a sudden loss of equilibrium, or during— He noted the thought without dramatizing it. A struggle. And if it fell into liquid at 8:12, and if that liquid was coffee, then coffee had been present in the study at 8:12, before the breakfast service, which meant the coffee had not been brought by Briggs at all, which meant Lady Margaret had died before breakfast. He opened his eyes. The library clock on the mantelpiece ticked with its unhurried authority. It read 11:23. Poirot looked at it with the particular attention he gave to clocks in this house. He had looked at the library clock before, on the morning of his first full day, and had noted the time at which Adrian had wound it. He had asked in passing what had seemed an entirely pointless question. At what time was the library clock wound? Adrian had answered with mild puzzlement that it was wound each evening before dinner, without fail, by Briggs. By Briggs. Each evening, without fail. A man of precise, unbroken habit. A man who moved through this house at fixed intervals, performing fixed tasks, and who therefore knew, could not help but know, exactly what was where and when, and who was present and who was absent at every hour of the domestic day, and of the domestic night. Poirot rose, straightened his tie, and went to find Evelyn Harper once more. She was in the morning room. She had, he noticed, changed her position since yesterday. She now sat facing the door rather than the window, which was the unconscious adjustment of a person who has decided they would prefer not to be surprised. She looked up when he entered with the expression of someone who had been expecting him and was not entirely pleased to have been right. "Mademoiselle," he said, taking the chair across from her without waiting to be invited, "I have this morning asked a great many questions that appeared to have no bearing on the matter at hand. I asked Miss Ravenscroft about the arrangement of portraits. I asked Dr. Calder about a dinner menu. I asked Adrian about a library clock." He paused. "I do not ask absurd questions, Miss Harper. I ask questions whose relevance is not yet visible. There is a distinction." She said nothing, but her hands, which had been still in her lap, had closed, very slightly, very quietly, into something that was not quite a fist. "I should like to ask you about the evening," he said. "Not the argument, not the letter. The hour after dinner. You accompanied Lady Margaret from the dining room at approximately 9:30. He looked at her steadily. "What happened in the study, Miss Harper, between 9:30 and the time you retired for the evening?" The silence that followed was the longest she had yet produced. Outside, the first thin rain of the afternoon had begun to fall, freckling the window glass, filling the room with the particular grey-silver quality of English light on the edge of winter. "We talked," she said at last. Her voice was entirely even. "About correspondence, about arrangements for the following week, about nothing of importance." "Nothing of importance," Poirot repeated. "Nothing," she said, "that I am prepared to discuss." It was the first time she had refused him directly, and it told him more than her answers had. He thanked her pleasantly, rose, and left her sitting in the grey light, with her hands still closed, and her eyes on the door long after he had passed through it. Chapter 6. What the Handwriting Said. The rain that had begun in the afternoon settled into the house by evening with every indication of permanence. It was not dramatic rain, no thunder, no wind to speak of. simply a steady, determined grey curtain that reduced the park to a few dark shapes at the edge of visibility and made the interior of Ravenscroft Hall feel, more than at any previous point, entirely self-contained, as though the world beyond the yew hedges had quietly ceased to exist and the house had become its own universe, complete with its own tensions, its own unresolved equations, its own version of time. Poirot found this atmospheric development, on the whole, congenial. A closed world suited a closed problem, and the problem was closing. He could feel it in the way one feels the shape of a room in darkness, armed by the resistance encountered at the edges. He was not yet at the walls, but he was near enough to understand the dimensions. Inspector Webb had telephoned at 3 o'clock with the preliminary results of the post-mortem examination. Poirot, who had been permitted by a combination of professional reputation and politely implacable persistence to be present for the call, listened from the other side of the desk as Webb received them. Arsenic, administered in a quantity sufficient to cause death within 6 to 8 hours of ingestion. Time of death, the pathologist estimated, between 10 o'clock the previous evening and 2 o'clock in the morning. Webb received this information with a satisfaction that was, Poirot observed, not entirely untroubled. The time of death created a small complication for the tidy narrative of a breakfast service poisoning, and Webb was a sufficiently honest man to notice it. He cleared his throat. Between 10 and 2, he said. That's earlier than I'd anticipated. Earlier, Poirot agreed, than the breakfast service. A silence. Briggs has maintained his confession consistently. He has maintained it with, one might say, impressive consistency, like a man reciting something he has memorized rather than something he remembers. Poirot tilted his head. There is a distinction, Inspector, between a confession that comes from guilt and one that comes from decision. The former is variable, contradictory, full of the irregular texture of actual experience. The latter is smooth. Too smooth, perhaps, for entire credibility. Webb looked at him with the expression of a man who suspects he is about to have his afternoon made considerably more complicated. You're saying he didn't do it? I am saying, Poirot replied with precision, that if he did do it, he did not do it in the way he claims. And if the method is false, one must ask why a man confesses to a crime in a false manner when a true manner was available to him. He rose. I should like, if you will permit it, to examine Lady Margaret's writing desk. The desk had been sealed in the cursory manner of a provincial investigation whose principal suspect had already confessed, with a length of tape across the drawers and a constable posted in the corridor who was reading a newspaper and felt mildly reproached by Poirot's expression as he passed. What the seal on the central drawer had not, Poirot noted, been applied with absolute precision. There was a gap at the left corner of perhaps a centimetre. Not enough for a hand. Enough for a thought to pass through. Webb broke the seal himself somewhat reluctantly and stood to one side. The desk was the desk of an organised woman. The drawers contained what one would expect. Correspondence in date order. Household accounts entered in a regular, legible hand. A small leather diary whose entries were factual and dispassionate. Appointments, weather, occasional brief notes on domestic matters. Poirot turned the diary's pages with gloved hands, not reading so much as listening, attending to the rhythm of a person through the way they habitually recorded their days. Lady Margaret's handwriting was consistent throughout, right up to the entry for 10 days previously. Then something changed. Not the content, the appointments continued. The accounts were entered correctly. But the quality of the script itself. A slight unevenness in the letter forms, a pressure on the pen that was fractionally too great, leaving the downstrokes darker than her usual hand. A person writing under sustained anxiety will betray it in their handwriting long before they betray it in their speech. He turned to the final entry. It was 3 days before her death, and it read, E.H. confirmed. Below this, nothing. The remaining pages were blank. Poirot looked at the 2 letters and the 1 word for a considerable time. E.H. confirmed. Not discovered, not revealed. Confirmed, en sens. As though a suspicion of long standing had finally been settled beyond further doubt. He closed the diary with care and set it aside. In the bottom drawer, beneath a folded map of the estate and a bundle of receipts from the previous decade, he found what he had not quite been looking for, but recognized immediately upon finding. It was a photograph, mounted on card in the style of some 30 years previous, showing a young woman of perhaps 22 standing before a garden wall. She was not a Ravenscroft. Her dress was plain, her posture without the bred-in assurance of the family portraits upstairs. She had a direct, serious gaze and dark hair, and a quality of composed self-possession that was, in its way, striking. On the reverse, in a hand that was not Lady Margaret's, Mary Sutton, 1903. Poirot turned the photograph over again and looked at the face of Mary Sutton for a long, quiet moment. He thought about a family secret, about a child born to a Ravenscroft household servant and cast out, about a secretary companion who had arrived 7 years ago with excellent references and asked no inconvenient questions and watched everything with those still, assessing eyes. He thought about the initials E.H. Then he thought about the face of the young woman in the photograph and the face of the woman he had sat across from in the morning room not 3 hours ago. And he let the thought he had been carefully not thinking since yesterday afternoon come fully into focus at last. The resemblance was not obvious. It was the kind of resemblance that exists between a grandmother and a granddaughter, diluted, refracted through a generation, visible only to someone who was looking for it, and or to someone who had already been told it was there. The set of the brow, something around the eyes. Poirot replaced the photograph exactly as he had found it and closed the drawer. He straightened and became aware with the particular peripheral awareness that long experience produces, that Webb was watching him with the concentrated attention of a man who knows something significant has occurred and is waiting to be told what it is. "Well," the inspector said. "The diary," Poirot said. "It contains an entry of some interest. I should like a copy made." He paused. "And I should like, if it can be arranged, to speak with Briggs tomorrow morning. Not at the station. Here, if possible. In the house he has served for 30 years. He smoothed an imaginary irregularity from his coat sleeve. A man speaks differently in a place that belongs to him, even a place that does not technically belong to him at all. Webb considered this. "I'll see what can be done." Poirot thanked him and left the study and stood in the corridor while the rain continued its patient work against the windows, and allowed himself 30 seconds of the profound stillness that preceded, in his private experience, the moment when a dispersed collection of observed facts became a single, coherent, inevitable shape. He was not there yet, but the shape was acquiring its outline. He took dinner that evening with the household. A subdued affair, yet largely silent, attended by the particular exhausted politeness of people who have been afraid and grieved and careful all day and have very little performance left in them by 7 o'clock. Adrian ate without appetite and drank with moderate excess. Clara moved food around her plate with the abstract concentration of someone thinking about something else entirely. Dr. Calder was quieter than usual, which was itself informative, or since Calder's natural register was a kind of genial verbal competence that required some effort to suppress. Evelyn Harper did not come to dinner. She had, the housemaid reported, asked for a tray in her room. Poirot noted the absence and ate his soup, which was adequate, and thought about handwriting and photographs and the precise compressed weight of 2 initials in a dead woman's diary. After dinner, while Adrian and Calder sat with their port and their respective silences, Poirot walked the ground floor of the house one final time. He was not looking for anything specific. He was completing what he thought of as the reading of a room. The way a musician will play a phrase repeatedly, not to learn the notes which are already known, but to understand what the notes are doing. He passed through the drawing room, the morning room, the library. In the library, the clock on the mantelpiece read 9:20. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the space beside the fireplace where, on his first evening, the 2 armchairs had stood at their incorrect angles. They were correct now. He had corrected them himself 2 days ago, which felt improbably distant. On the table between the chairs, he noticed something he had not noticed before. A book, placed face down to hold a page, with a pair of reading glasses folded on top of it. The glasses were not Clara's, whose prescription he had observed on the morning room table. They were not Lady Margaret's, whose spectacle case remained in the study. They were a plain, round-framed pair, functional rather than elegant. He looked at the title of the book. It was a history of Hampshire, published in 1921, opened somewhere in its middle. He did not touch it. He simply noted it, added it to the accumulation, and turned off the library light. On the stairs, going up, he passed the portrait of Eleanor Ravenscroft of 1841 and her opinionated expression, and felt, or for the first time since his arrival, that the dead Ravenscrofts were no longer simply watching him pass. They were, perhaps, beginning to answer. Chapter 7. The conversation with Briggs arrived at 10 o'clock. He was brought in a police motor car that had the good manners to deposit him at the servants' entrance, rather than the front, which was either a thoughtful concession to 30 years of habit or a bureaucratic accident. Either way, Briggs descended from it with the same composed unhurriedness with which he appeared to do everything, straightened his coat, and walked into the house he had served since 1903, as though he had simply been away on an errand. Poirot had arranged to speak with him in the butler's pantry. It was, he had decided the previous evening, the only room in the house that belonged entirely to Briggs. Not to the family, not to the occasion, not to the performance of any particular social role, but simply to the man himself and the work he had made of his life. The pantry was small and functional, a worn wooden table, 2 plain chairs, shelves of household silver in varying states of polish, a clock on the wall, whose tick was the most companionable sound Poirot had yet encountered in Ravenscroft Hall. Briggs sat. He folded his hands on the table with the precision of a man placing pieces on a board. He looked at Poirot. Monsieur Poirot. The voice was as it had always been, measured, uninflected, giving nothing that had not been consciously offered. Briggs. Poirot returned the look with the particular quality of attention that was, he had been told, somewhat disconcerting to sit across from. It was not aggressive. It was simply total. I am going to speak to you very plainly, because I think you are a man who has had quite enough of oblique approaches for 1 week. He paused. You did not poison Lady Margaret's coffee. You did not poison Lady Margaret at all. I know this with a certainty that is no longer a matter of intuition, but of fact. And when Inspector Webb receives the full results of his inquiries, he will know it also. He let that settle. What I do not yet know, what I'm asking you now in this room to tell me, is what you did see, and what you have, at considerable personal cost, chosen to conceal. The clock ticked. Rain from the previous evening had left the windows streaked, and through them the kitchen garden presented its bare or honest rouse. I made a statement, Briggs said, to the police. You made a construction. There is a difference. Your statement contains no false facts. You are too careful for that. Every element is technically possible. None of it is true. Poirot folded his own hands on the table, a mirroring so precise it might have been deliberate. A man does not maintain a false confession out of cowardice. You are not a coward. He maintains it out of love, or out of duty, and I think this is closest in your case, out of a conviction that the truth, if told, will destroy something he has given his life to preserving. Something moved in Briggs' face. Not much. Enough. The family, Poirot said quietly. Miss Clara, specifically. The hands on the table shifted. A millimetre, no more. Miss Clara, Briggs said, has done nothing wrong in her life. She has not a dishonest bone in her body. She is... He paused, and something in the pause contained, Poirot thought, the compressed weight of 3 decades of watching a child grow. The best of them. The best this family has produced in my time here, which is saying something, because they were not, on balance, a bad family. Only... He stopped again. Only human, Poirot supplied. Briggs inclined his head fractionally. Tell me about the night, Poirot said, not pressing, simply opening the door. For a long moment he did not think Briggs would walk through it, but the butler sat with his hands folded and his eyes directed at the middle distance, and the clock continued its patient work, and the kitchen garden waited in its winter patience outside. Then Briggs said, I was in the silver corridor at 11 o'clock, as I am every evening. The service door at that end requires a particular attention in wet weather. The wood swells in the frame. One must ensure the lock has engaged fully, or it will be open by morning. He spoke with the careful flatness of a man translating memory into record. I heard voices from the study, Lady Margaret's and Miss Harper's. Poirot said nothing. They were not arguing. That is not the word. It was, Briggs considered, a confrontation of a particular kind. The kind where one person is prepared carefully and the other is wholly unprepared. Miss Harper's voice was controlled throughout. Lady Margaret's was not. I heard Lady Margaret say, a pause precise as a rest in music, I did what I believed was right, and Miss Harper replied, you did what was convenient. The distinction mattered to my mother, if not to you. The pantry was very quiet. I did not hear everything that followed, Briggs continued. I am not a man who listens at doors. I heard what I heard while attending to the lock, and then I moved away. Oh, because whatever was happening in that room was not mine to witness." He paused. "I heard, before I was fully out of range, something fall, a sound of something on the floor, small, hard, then nothing further." "And in the morning," Poirot said, "when you understood what had happened." "In the morning I understood that Miss Harper had been alone with Lady Margaret the previous evening, and that Lady Margaret was dead, and that the manner of her death was one that required time and preparation and access." Briggs's voice had not changed in quality or volume throughout. It was this steadiness, Poirot reflected, that made it difficult to listen to. "I understood that if I said nothing, suspicion would eventually fall on Miss Harper, and from her it would reach the question of why she had come to this household, and, from that question, it would reach Miss Clara." "Clara," Poirot said carefully. "Or what does Clara know?" "Nothing. That is precisely the point." The word "nothing" carried in Briggs' pronunciation the full weight of 30 years' effort. Lady Margaret ensured it. Whatever her other failings, she spent the last decade of her life ensuring that Miss Clara would not know. I disagreed with a good many of Lady Margaret's choices. I did not disagree with that one. Poirot looked at him for a moment. "And yet, you believed Miss Harper had killed her." "I believed it was possible. I believed the circumstances made it the most probable explanation." The hands, still folded, were perfectly still. "I did not think her a monster. I thought her a woman who had arrived at a point where she believed she had no other means available to her. That is," something in his expression adjusted very finely, "a position I find I'm able to understand, if not to endorse." "And so you confessed." "And so I confessed. To protect Miss Clara from a scandal that was not of her making, and that would serve no purpose beyond her injury. Lady Margaret is dead. That cannot be altered. But Miss Clara's life is ahead of her, and it seemed to me that one of the few things remaining within my power was to ensure it remained undamaged." He met Poirot's eyes directly for the first time, with a look that was entirely without appeal. He was not asking for approval. He was simply, at last, telling the truth. "I am prepared to accept whatever consequence follows from that decision." Poirot was silent for a moment. He thought about loyalty, its uses, its costs, the particular English variety of it that expressed itself not in declaration, but in action and silence, and which was, he had long ago decided, a quality that resisted easy moral summary. "The small sound," he said at last, "the thing that fell just before you moved away. You know what it was." Briggs looked at him. "I found the watch the next morning, when I entered the study before the household rose. I knew Lady Margaret's habits. I knew which side of the desk she took her coffee, and I knew the watch should have been in her pocket, and I knew what it meant that the hands had stopped at 12 minutes past 8, when I had not brought coffee until past. His voice, for the first time, was very slightly less even than it had been. "I replaced it on the floor where I found it. I did not wish to disturb the arrangement of the room. I knew by then that I intended to confess, and that the watch, if attended to carefully, would eventually tell someone the truth I was not yet prepared to tell myself." Poirot regarded him with an expression that those who knew him would have found, perhaps, surprising. It was not triumph. It was something considerably more complex and considerably less comfortable. "Briggs," he said. You left a clue." The butler met his gaze with perfect composure and said nothing. But in the silence, Poirot heard quite distinctly the answer. "Yes, I left it for you." Chapter 8. The Shape. Beneath the surface. Poirot left the pantry at 11:20 and walked directly to the morning room without pausing, without looking at the portraits, without attending to the symmetry of a hall table whose arrangement had been subtly disturbed by the constable's coat being draped across it. This was, in itself, notable. The hall table ordinarily would have arrested him for at least 5 seconds. That it did not indicated a degree of internal occupation that left no portion of his attention available for the exterior world. He sat in the morning room with his hands on his knees and his eyes open and his mind doing what it did at this particular stage of any investigation. Moving through the established facts not in sequence but simultaneously, holding them all in a kind of illuminated suspension and waiting for the arrangement that made each one necessary rather than merely possible. He had been wrong about one thing. He acknowledged this without discomfort. The capacity for dispassionate self-correction was, he considered, among the more valuable instruments in his professional equipment. He had assumed that Briggs discovered the body before the household rose and had arranged the scene accordingly. But Briggs's account placed his entry to the study in the early morning as a matter of routine. He had found Lady Margaret already at her desk, already dead, already arranged in the posture in which the household would discover her some hours later. He had found the watch on the floor and left it there. He had not arranged the scene, which meant someone else had. Someone had seated Lady Margaret at her desk after her death, or she had died there, which was possible, and had placed the coffee cup beside her hand, and had done all of this with the deliberate intention of presenting a false morning to the household. Not a crude deception, a considered one built on an accurate understanding of domestic routine and human expectation. The household would wake, breakfast would be served. Lady Margaret would be found at her desk with her morning coffee, apparently having risen early to attend to correspondence. The time of death, obscured by the intervening hours, would be assumed to coincide with the coffee. It was, Poirot reflected, genuinely clever, not in the showy sense that attracted his mild contempt, but in the quieter, more dangerous sense of a plan that understood people, their habits, their assumptions, their tendency to see what they expected to see, rather than what was actually before them. The gloves. He returned to the gloves which had been, from the beginning, the detail that refused to settle quietly. The cup wiped clean. Not in haste. In haste one leaves traces, partial prints, the smear of a palm. The cup had been handled with the care of someone who had thought about it beforehand. Someone who brought gloves to the study not as an afterthought, but as part of a prepared intention. Prepared, systematic. These words, once admitted, arranged everything else around them with the inevitability of a key turning in a lock. He rose and went to find Evelyn Harper. She was not in her room. What the housemaid encountered on the landing indicated that Miss Harper had gone out, walking, apparently, despite the damp, in the direction of the south garden. Poirot descended, retrieved his coat and hat from the stand in the entrance hall, and went out through the terrace door into the grey morning. She was standing at the far end of the formal garden, beside the sundial that occupied the centre of the parterre, looking at nothing in particular with the focused inattention of a person deep in calculation. She heard his footsteps on the gravel, and turned, and for a moment before the composure reasserted itself, he saw in her face something raw and complicated and exhausted, which was the face she wore when there was no performance left to give. He stopped a few feet from her. The yew hedges rose on three sides, dark and absolute, sealing the garden from the park beyond. The sundial between them was green with damp, its brass gnomon tarnished to the colour of old coins. "Mademoiselle Harper," he said, "I have this morning spoken with Briggs." She received this information without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. He told me what he heard on the night of Lady Margaret's death, the confrontation in the study, what you said to her. He paused. What she replied. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the yew walls, a wood pigeon made its repetitive, indifferent comment on the proceedings. She said she did what she believed was right, Evelyn Harper said. Her voice was flat, without the careful modulation he was accustomed to from her. That was her position. After everything, after 30 years, she had arrived at a settled peace with it, and she intended, I think, to die in that peace. Something moved in her expression. Grief and anger so intertwined they were no longer separable. My mother died in a rented room in Portsmouth in 1921. She died knowing that the man who had destroyed her life was himself dying comfortably in this house, surrounded by his family, and that the woman who had cast her out was still presiding over it all, with her impeccable dignity intact. Poirot said nothing. There were moments when silence was not a technique but simply the only honest response. I did not come here to kill her, Evelyn Harper said. I want you to understand that, because it is true and because I find I care, somewhat against my expectation, whether you believe it or not. She looked at the sundial. I came to make her know, to make her sit across from the granddaughter of the woman she had destroyed and understand what that destruction had produced, not to excuse it, not to be forgiven, simply to know. She paused. 7 years of knowing, 7 years of watching her manage her conscience into something she could live with. She was not without feeling about it. I will grant her that. But feeling, without consequence, is merely comfortable. And the letter, Poirot said, 3 days before her death. I told her I had found the documentation. What remained of it, she had been burning papers for weeks, as you will no doubt have established. But she had not burned everything. There were letters from 1903. From my grandfather, the man responsible. Letters that recorded in his own hand and what he had done and what Lady Margaret had agreed to conceal. A pause. I told her I intended to give them to a solicitor, to make the matter of public record, not for money. I want no money from this family, but because my mother's name deserved to exist in some document other than a servant's dismissal record. And she refused. She was frightened for Clara, she said, and perhaps that was true. I think she genuinely loved Clara. But she was also frightened for herself, for the name, for the monument she had made of her own respectability. Harper's voice did not rise. It simply hardened very slightly at the edges. We argued that evening. She became distressed. She stood up from the desk too quickly, and she struck the corner of the chair, and the watch fell from her pocket into the coffee cup. And she sat down again, very heavily, and her colour was wrong. And I understood then that she was more unwell than I had known. Poirot was very still. She had been ill for some months, Harper continued. Her heart. I did not know the extent of it. Dr. Calder knew. I think he had known for some time. She died, the voice held with considerable effort, before I left the room, not from the argument, from her heart which had been failing since the summer, and which chose that evening to fail completely. She looked at Poirot directly. There was no poison. There was no murder. There was a woman who had lived badly in one particular regard and died, as it happened, in the presence of the person most wronged by it. I do not know what to make of that. I have not yet arrived at a position. Poirot looked at her for a long moment. The damp cold settled around them both with impartial thoroughness. "The coffee cup," he said. "The staging of the scene." She met his eyes steadily. "I panicked. It is not a defence. I know what it looks like, and I know it was wrong. And I was alone with a dead woman in the middle of the night, and I had been her antagonist, and she had documents in her desk connecting my family to hers, and I—" She stopped. "I arranged the room. I brought the cup from the kitchen because the original had spilled when the watch fell into it, and I placed it as it should have been, and I wiped it because I had been wearing gloves. It is cold work in this house, before the fires are lit. And then I went to my room and lay awake until morning and waited to see what would happen. And then Briggs confessed. Yes. Something crossed her face that was not relief and not guilt, but a third thing, specific to the knowledge that another person has paid a price you did not ask them to pay. I did not ask him to. I did not know he would. I have been," she searched for the word with visible effort, "undone by it, or rather." Poirot turned the stopped watch in his coat pocket, where it had resided for 3 days, and thought about the particular moral complexity of a situation in which the truth, when fully assembled, contained no villain of the simple sort, and no innocence of the simple sort either, but only people doing the inadequate best available to them in the circumstances history had constructed around them. "Come inside, mademoiselle," he said at last. "There is a great deal still to discuss. And the grey cells function less efficiently in the cold." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. Then she turned from the sundial and walked with him back across the gravel toward the house. And neither of them spoke, and the yew hedges stood in their dark patience on either side. And above the gables the sky was the colour of old pewter, and beginning, very faintly, to clear. Chapter 9. The Drawing Room. Inspector Webb listened to Poirot for 22 minutes without interruption, which was, in Poirot's experience, the mark of a man whose intelligence was operating at full capacity, and who had the uncommon wisdom to know that questions asked prematurely produce answers of reduced value. When Poirot finished, Webb sat for a moment with his hands flat on the dining room table and his gaze directed at the window, through which the garden was conducting its slow brightening in the thin November sunshine that had arrived at last, with the diffident punctuality of something that knows it is not entirely welcome. "Natural causes," Webb said at last. "A heart that had been failing for some months, according to Dr. Calder, who has been managing the conditions since the summer. Lady Margaret had declined to inform the household of its extent. She was—" Poirot chose the description with care. "A woman who held a settled conviction that dignity required the concealment of physical weakness. Calder will confirm it. The post-mortem will confirm it. And the staging of the scene, the cup, the gloves. A panic, Mademoiselle Harper tells me, and I believe her, not because I am sentimental about panic as a motive, but because the staging, examined carefully, is precisely what panic produces. It is convincing at a glance and does not survive scrutiny. A calculated deception would have been better made. He paused. She is guilty of obstructing the inquiry, of placing the cup, of allowing an innocent man to be held on a false charge without immediately correcting it, which is the count I expect she will find the hardest to answer for, and which she should. He met Webb's eyes. But she did not kill Lady Margaret Ravenscroft. Lady Margaret's heart killed Lady Margaret Ravenscroft, in the fullness of a life that had, in one specific regard, been lived very badly indeed. Webb drummed his fingers once on the table, a single, thoughtful beat, then stopped. Briggs. Briggs made a false confession to protect the family from scandal, specifically to protect Miss Clara Ravenscroft from the knowledge that her aunt had decades ago destroyed the life of a servant woman and concealed the fact for the entirety of Clara's existence. Poirot folded his hands. It was, by any legal measure, obstruction. By any human measure, it was an act of a particular and not ignoble kind of devotion. I leave the weighting of those two assessments to you, Inspector, and to the courts, with only the observation that Briggs is 61 years old, has not a single mark against his name in 30 years of service, and deliberately left a clue. The watch on the floor of the study, in a position he knew would attract attention, so that the truth would not remain permanently buried. Webb looked at him. He wanted to be found out. He wanted the truth to be found. There is, again, a distinction. Poirot permitted himself the faintest elevation of one eyebrow. He trusted that the right person would find it. It is perhaps the most considerable compliment I have been paid in some years, and delivered entirely without a word. The inspector almost smiled. I'll need to speak with Miss Harper formally, and with Calder about the medical history. He pushed back his chair with the air of a man accepting a more complex afternoon than he had planned for. The family will need to be told. Yes, Poirot said. I had thought, if you are agreeable, to speak with them myself, in the drawing room, this afternoon, before you make your formal statements. He paused. There are things that require saying to them that are not, strictly speaking, your professional obligation, but which I believe should be said. Webb studied him. You want to give them the whole thing, the history of it. I want to give them the truth of it, which is not quite the same as the whole of it, but which is, I think, what this particular situation requires. He stood, straightening his coat with the small, habitual precision that was entirely unconscious. An unexamined secret has occupied this house for 30 years, Inspector. It has shaped the behaviour of every person in it, and has now, indirectly, produced a death, a false confession, and a life spent in the pursuit of a justice that arrived, when it arrived, in a form no one had anticipated and no one entirely wanted. It seems to me that the people who remain ought to understand what happened, not the legal summary, the human one. Webb said nothing for a moment. Then, 2 o'clock. The drawing room, assembled at 2 o'clock, what had about it the quality of a room in which the weather has finally broken. The sustained, effortful calm of the previous 3 days had given way to something raw and more honest. Adrian, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set at an angle that suggested he was bracing for something. Clara, pale and very straight in the chair nearest the fire, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Poirot, with the focused attention of someone who has decided that whatever is coming, they will meet it without flinching. Dr. Calder standing to one side of the window with the specific stillness of a man who knows more of what is coming than the others and is not certain it was his to know. Evelyn Harper sat apart beside the door, in the chair furthest from the centre of the room, and from the family, which was, Poirot thought, a geography that told its own story. Briggs was not present. Poirot had asked that he not be, which was one of two requests he had made of Inspector Webb, the second of which he had not yet delivered. He stood by the fireplace. He had stood in this spot in his mind since the second evening when the shape of the eventual gathering had first presented itself as a possibility, and looked at the assembled faces, and began. "I will not," he said, "present this as a mystery resolved, because it is not a mystery in the technical sense, and its resolution is not a tidy one. It is rather a history. And like most histories, it is concerned less with events than with the consequences of choices made long before the events occurred." He told them about Mary Sutton. He told them plainly, without softening and without embellishment, what the letters in the desk recorded, and what Lady Margaret had agreed to conceal, and what that concealment had produced over the decades that followed. A woman cast out, a child born into poverty, yet a granddaughter who grew up with an absence where a history should have been, and who filled that absence in time with the only thing available to her: the determination to stand in this house and make its mistress understand the scale of what she had done. He watched Clara's face as he spoke. She did not look away. She did not weep, though twice her expression tightened briefly with the particular pain of someone revising in real time the account they have given their own life. She was, yet as Briggs had said, the best of them. Adrian said nothing throughout. His earlier restlessness had entirely gone. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the carpet, and his stillness was not the stillness of indifference, but of a man absorbing something that requires the full suspension of his ordinary defences. Poirot told them about the evening, about the confrontation in the study, about Lady Margaret's heart, about the manner of her death. He told them about Evelyn Harper's panic and the staged scene and the stopped watch and the 3 days of careful, unhurried inquiry that had assembled the truth from its dispersed pieces. He told them about Briggs, what he had heard, what he had understood, what he had chosen, and why. When he reached Briggs, Clara made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a cry, and pressed her fingers to her mouth. She recovered immediately, but the sound had been there, and in the drawing-room's attentive silence it carried. Poirot turned to Evelyn Harper. She was sitting with her hands folded and her eyes on him, steady and without appeal, in the manner he had come to recognize as her form of courage. "Mademoiselle Harper," he said, "did what she did from motives that are, in their origin, entirely comprehensible, and in their execution, not entirely to be condemned. She came to this house seeking acknowledgement of a wrong that had been real and consequential and deliberately buried. She found it. She found also," he paused, "that justice, when it arrives through a door we ourselves have opened, does not always look as we imagined it would." He looked at her directly. "You will answer as you must for the obstruction of this inquiry. That is not negotiable, and I would not ask that it be. But you should know, and I ask that everyone in this room understands, that Lady Margaret Ravenscroft was not murdered. She died of a heart that had been failing for months, in the presence of the granddaughter of the woman she had most wronged, which is not justice and not punishment, but simply the way certain lives complete themselves. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the thin sunshine had continued its cautious work, and the garden, through the long windows, looked for the first time since Poirot's arrival like a place that might, in another season, be pleasant. "The letters," Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. "Mary Sutton's history. What happens to it?" Poirot looked at her. Then he looked at Evelyn Harper. "That," he said, "is a matter that concerns Miss Harper and Miss Ravenscroft, and no one else in this room. I have formed a view on it, which I will share privately if I am asked. I will not impose it." He allowed a brief pause. "I will say only that a name, restored to the record from which it was expunged, costs those who restore it very little, and means to those for whom it is restored a very great deal." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Clara turned to Evelyn Harper, and the look that passed between them was one that Poirot, in his professional discretion, chose not to examine too closely. Some things required an audience, others did not. He moved quietly to the door. To Chapter 10, Order Restored. The second request Poirot had made of Inspector Webb was a modest one, and Webb, to his credit, had received it without the predictable objections. The request was this: that Briggs be permitted to spend the remainder of the day at Ravenscroft Hall before any formal proceedings were initiated. One day, in the house that had been, for 30 years, the only world he had chosen to inhabit. Webb had looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man performing a rapid private calculation between professional obligation and human judgment. Then he had said, "Until 6 o'clock," in a tone that suggested the matter was closed, and he did not wish to discuss it further. Poirot had thanked him and said nothing more, which was, he found, precisely the right response. He encountered Briggs at 3 o'clock in the corridor outside the study, not loitering, not purposefully occupied, but standing in the particular manner of a man taking a considered farewell of something he has not yet left. The study door was closed. The corridor was quiet. The house around them carried the muffled, tentative quality of a place that has been through considerable difficulty and is not yet certain what it is now. Briggs turned when he heard Poirot's step. His expression was what it had always been: composed, uninflected, giving nothing that had not been consciously offered. And yet there was something different in it today, something that Poirot identified after a moment's consideration as the specific quality of a man who has been carrying a weight for some days and has set it down. Not relief, precisely. Something quieter than relief. "Monsieur Poirot." He inclined his head. "Briggs." Poirot stopped beside him and looked, as Briggs was looking, at the closed study door. "You are all right." It was a simple question without professional agenda, and Briggs received it with a momentary stillness that suggested he was not entirely accustomed to being asked it. "I am," he said, "as well as the circumstances permit, which is to say, adequately." "Adequately," Poirot repeated. "It is, in my experience, an underrated condition." They stood together for a moment in the corridor, two men of different countries and entirely different lives, united by the particular fellowship of people who notice things other people miss and have learned, at some cost, the weight of that capacity. "Miss Clara," Poirot said. "She will come through it." Briggs considered the closed door. "Yes," he said, with a conviction so unqualified it sounded less like prediction than simple fact. "She will." A pause. She came to find me this morning before the drawing room. She wanted me to know—" He stopped. His composure, which had survived 3 days of extraordinary pressure without visible deterioration, adjusted itself by the smallest margin. "She is, as I said, the best of them." Poirot did not press further. He had asked what he had needed to ask, and the answer had been given in the way it needed to be given. And the corridor received them both in its quiet patience while the November light moved through the mullioned windows at the far end and made slow gold parallelograms on the stone floor. He left Ravenscroft Hall at 4:30. The motorcar moved back down the winding drive between the yew hedges, which were the same as they had been on his arrival, clipped, dark, precisely symmetrical. And Poirot watched them through the window with an attention that was no longer professional, but simply present. The attention of a man taking in the last of a place he does not expect to see again. The house receded behind him. The hedges gave way to open park, and then to the road, and then to the lanes of Hampshire going about their quiet business in the thin afternoon light. He arrived back in London at 7 o'clock. His flat on Whitehaven Mansions received him with the mute approval of a well-ordered space welcoming its proper occupant. The rooms were warm. The Evening Post had been arranged on the hall table by his valet George, with the geometric precision Poirot had, over some years, impressed upon him as a professional necessity rather than a personal eccentricity. The objects on the mantelpiece stood in their correct relations. The curtains hung in the symmetry that the Hampshire curtains had so consistently failed to achieve. Everything was, in the most literal sense, in its place. Poirot stood in the centre of his sitting room and breathed it in. Then he removed from his coat pocket the silver watch and set it on the mantelpiece, between the small bronze figurine and the correspondence. He stood back and looked at it. The hands still read 12 minutes past 8, frozen at the moment of their interruption, and the watch was silent. A stopped thing, a record of the instant when a particular story had reached its turning point, and everything that came before it had become, irrevocably, the past. He wound it. It was a small action, requiring perhaps 10 seconds, and when he set it back on the mantelpiece it was ticking. A small, steady, purposeful sound that joined the other sounds of the flat and the evening, the distant traffic, George moving in the kitchen, the ordinary inhabited noise of a life proceeding as it should. The hands would need to be set. He would set them tomorrow. For tonight, 12 minutes past 8 was as accurate an accounting of the moment as any other, and the watch was running, which was, he thought, the important thing. Hastings arrived at 8. He arrived in the manner he generally arrived, without advance notice, with a letter in his hand that he had apparently been meaning to post for a fortnight, and with the expression of a man who has been at loose ends for several days, and finds himself unreasonably cheered by the sight of a familiar armchair. He divested himself of his coat, accepted the whisky and soda George produced with trained anticipation, and settled himself with the ease of a man returning to his natural habitat. "You've been away," he observed, with the detective instinct that Poirot found simultaneously endearing and inaccurate. "I have been in Hampshire, mon ami, for 4 days." Hampshire. Hastings absorbed this with the expression he reserved for counties he found vaguely improbable. What happened in Hampshire? Poirot was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire with the composed inward expression that Hastings had learned, over many years, to recognize as the sign of a case being privately concluded. filed, labelled, and placed in the appropriate drawer of that remarkable internal archive. "A death," Poirot said at last. "A family secret of 30 years standing. A butler of exceptional moral seriousness. And a woman who spent 7 years waiting for an acknowledgement that arrived, in the end, too late and too completely for any comfort, including her own." "Good Lord!" Hastings set down his glass. Was there a murder?" "There was not. There was a heart that had been failing since the summer, and a confrontation that the heart was not equal to, and a very great deal of unhappiness distributed over 3 decades and several lives." Poirot turned from the fire. "The butler confessed to it, which was the first thing I noticed. Confessions of that smoothness are generally not confessions at all, but rather constructions, made from true materials, entirely false in assembly." "So the butler did it," Hastings said, with the tone of a man arriving at a satisfying conclusion. Poirot looked at him with an affection that was entirely genuine, and a patience that had been, over the years, very thoroughly exercised. "No, mon ami, the butler most certainly did not do it." "But you said he confessed." "He confessed. He did not do it. The two things are not," Poirot said, with the mild emphasis of a man making a distinction for what he suspects is not the first time, "the same." Hastings considered this. "Then what did the butler do?" Poirot was quiet for a moment. He looked at the watch on the mantelpiece, ticking its steady and now accurate account of the present moment, and thought about 30 years of service and a man who had given his entire working life to a family that was not his own, and had found at the end of it that love expressed through duty is no less real for being unconventional, and no less costly for being freely chosen. "The butler," he said, "told a lie, for love." Hastings opened his mouth, closed it, and then said with the honesty that was his most reliable quality, "I'm not entirely sure I follow." "No," said Poirot gently, "perhaps not. It is the kind of thing that requires, I think, a certain proximity to the particular circumstances." He picked up his own glass. "It is enough to say that order has been restored. Not the order that existed before. That order was built in part on a concealment, and concealments are poor foundations. But a different order, a truer one perhaps, which is," he turned the glass in his fingers, "the best that can generally be hoped for." Hastings looked at him for a moment. "You sound almost sorry it's over." "I am never sorry when a thing is over," Poirot said. "I am sometimes sorry about what the ending reveals, about the gap between what people might have been to one another and what, through pride and fear and the protection of names and appearances, they actually managed." He set the glass down. In this case, the gap was large. It had 30 years in which to become so. Hastings nodded slowly, which was his way of indicating that he had followed the substance, if not every particular. It was a response Poirot had always respected. There was a quality of honest effort in it. They sat for a while in the comfortable silence of long acquaintance while the fire did its work and the evening traffic moved in its indifferent patterns below the window, and the watch on the mantelpiece made its small, steady, recovered sound. Poirot looked at it once more before he turned away. At Ravenscroft Hall, he knew, the study desk stood empty. The season was completing its business with the garden, the last of the leaves long gone, and the formal beds given over to their winter patience, the yew hedges standing in their dark and immovable symmetry, as they had stood for a century and would stand for another. The portraits on the stairs gazed down at the hallway where no one, just now, was passing. And on the mantelpiece of the study, where Poirot had placed it on his last morning at the house, a silver pocket watch ticked in the quiet room. Its hands showed the correct time. It had been wound and set, and returned to its purpose. It did not know, and could not have been told, that this was, in its small way, the most hopeful thing in the house.